I'd like to transition and introduce our next speaker, Corin Lightning Earl. Blue Thunderbird Woman is Cree from Samson Cree Nation. She's the legal director of Wekotowin Law and Governance Lodge, a sessional instructor at Maskwacis Cultural College and the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. She's also a board member for the First Nations Caring Society, Peace Hills Insurance, and for LEAF Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. After graduating from law school in 2007 at the University of Alberta, Corin was called to the bar in February 2009 and had the honor of having her bar call in her First Nation community, Samson Cree Nation. She's received her Master of Law in 2018 from Osgoode Hall, where her concentration was alternative dispute resolution, and her work focuses on working with Indigenous clients and supporting the revitalization of Indigenous laws. She was president of the Indigenous Bar Association for 6 years and is the former acting commissioner for the Alberta Utilities Commission. Corin also advises in the areas of Indigenous governance, Indigenous child welfare, and Indian Act matters. She was awarded the Alumni Horizon Award from the University of Alberta in 2017 and the Tomorrow's Leader Award from Women in Law Leadership Awards in 2019. She's an alumnus of the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference, the 2017 Northwest Territories Tour, and most recently she was awarded the Pringle Royal Sessional Teaching Excellence Award from the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta for 2021-2022. Corin, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and I will pass it over to you.
All right, Danse, hello everybody. I'm just going to load up my presentation. Share screen. Okay. I want to, here we go. There we go. All right. Okay. No, I don't, is it present? I don't think it's presenting the slides. Nope. Oh, apparently I have to give permission. Oh. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, let's see if this works now. Okay, sorry, it's just not working. I'll email you right now. Oh, sorry, everybody. Sorry really about this. Okay, we're good to go now. I sent it to you. I don't know why my computer doesn't want to allow. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that, everybody. There's always some sort of technical difficulties, even though we've been online forever. So as we're getting loading, so my name is Corin Lightning Earl. I am the legal director of Wakoto Lodge. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Sometimes when people read off your bios as an Indigenous person, it's sometimes overwhelming, or I think just as a person in general, always like, my name's Corin Lightning and I do stuff. And I work with Indigenous communities and I work with laws and I'm a lawyer. And yeah, so Wakoto Lodge is a legal research unit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do, who we are, what we do, and how we revitalize Indigenous laws, and how the revitalization of Indigenous laws under TRC Call to Action number 50 is going to help us move forward in a way that advances Indigenous people. So next slide. So Wakoto Lodge, so our main purpose is we support communities' goals to identify, articulate, and implement their own laws and governments. We develop, amplify, and transfer wise practices. We're a research unit, so we have research methods and tools. We're based out of the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. We have a nice little space inside the law school where when you walk in, it's a very nice, cozy, warm space filled with students and snacks and community. Our tagline is we uphold Indigenous laws and governance, and what we do is we also produce a lot of PLE, so a lot of practical legal education resources. The Wakoto Lodge was created out of the express needs of communities and in response to TRC Call to Action number 50, which calls for the creation of Indigenous law institutes for the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous laws. Next slide. Our principles are Wakotoan and Miyawachitiwan. These are our legal principles that govern our relationships and how we work with communities and how we do our work. So we very much are on that concept of family. That's why our space is always full. And we really want to create that family atmosphere for our students that come into law school, because many of our students that come into law school from Indigenous communities are used to that concept of family. So when they come into the law school, we're able to come into the lodge and have that same feeling of family, have that same place where they can come in and have a tea, where they can have a conversation, where they can kind of take off that armor that they wear when we're going into law school. And so we really foster that, especially with the work that we're doing when we build relationships. Next slide. Our grounding principles are Indigenous laws need to be treated seriously as laws. Indigenous laws are laws. And that's our guiding philosophy in the work that we do, is that Indigenous laws are laws. They are not sub-law. They're not law adjacent. They are up there at the same level as common law and civil law. And so we conduct our research in the same standard that we would any other law. And Indigenous laws, they're just one aspect of Indigenous communities. And really revitalizing those laws is really essential for how we're going to move forward in this Canada. Next slide. Indigenous law and Aboriginal law, sometimes people get confused, and that's okay. Aboriginal law is a term that many people hear, but Aboriginal law, it's judge-made law. It's Aboriginal peoples in the Crown. So it's those court cases that we hate, like Delgamuukw, Sparrow. Those are cases where it's Indigenous peoples being determined, the issues being determined and decided upon based on colonial law. Whereas Indigenous law, it's rooted in Indigenous societies, it's those Indigenous legal orders, it's those things that we knew whenever we wake up. It's those principles that guide us. And so there is a difference in what they are. Next slide. Indigenous societies have had laws. They've had ways of being for many years. We've had societies long before people came across the ocean. We had ways of being. We had ways of interaction. But sometimes, and most normally, Indigenous law doesn't look like Western law, and it doesn't have to. Our laws have been derived and in practice and passed on to elders and families. They've been within our bodies for Indigenous societies, and they continue to be recorded in various forms, including stories, song, practices, and customs. I learned about how to not be sneaky by learning about the tales of Wisakicha, who was a Cree trickster. And so I learned about what to do and how to not be tricky and all of those type of things. And I learned about kindness also from Wisakicha. Next slide. Indigenous laws, they're not, again, it's not restorative justice or Aboriginal courts or healing programs. Again, those are things where it's state law applied to Indigenous peoples. But Indigenous laws can be those things that are deeply rooted, sourced in the earth. They can be recent, they can be drafted, they can look like treaty, they can look like agreements, they can look like bylaws, they can have elements of Indigenous legal traditions and other sources of law. Next slide. When I think about Indigenous law, and when sometimes I get asked, well, did you have law prior? Yes, we were not a lawless people when people came across the ocean, but we had laws, we had ways of being. And so if we think about Roots to Renaissance, which is a paper written by Val Napoleon Hadley Friedland about 1,000 years ago, there was law, there was law. But then when you start to see repression and resilience is between the last 100 and 400 years, where people came across the ocean and they started to repress that, started to have to hide it. Laws were created that you weren't allowed to practice your laws. You weren't allowed to practice the potlatch. Sun dances and things were banned and all of those things. Thankfully, those were still practiced. They were just farther away, kind of back in the bush where maybe the Indian agent couldn't get with their vehicle. So we held on to those. So then we started to see a recovery and a revitalization in the last 10 to 40 years. So when we even we were able to vote. Indigenous people weren't allowed to vote until the 60s. So then those kind of laws were started to recognize us as citizens, that we were allowed to be humans like everybody else. And so we started to see that revitalization of things happening. And we've seen a lot happen in the 70s and 80s. People were going to law school. People were getting other things. They were creating all of these different organizations to advance Indigenous peoples. Then about 10 years, to now, we start to see this resurgent renaissance where people are engaging with Indigenous laws as law. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. So Indigenous laws, they're deliberative. They're not, and they can be debated. They're not necessarily declarations, but they're principles and processes, not positions. Whenever I would ask, like, is this right or wrong? I would never get that answer from my dad. It's about the principles and processes behind it. Indigenous laws can be used in implicit or informal ways. They can be damaged. They can be also misunderstood and mistrusted, because when you see what happened in those Roots to Renaissance, that repression and those kind of things can be damaged, and then people might not be familiar with them, so maybe they don't trust them. They can be shared in ways that are not familiar to legal professionals, and they're rarely recognized, resourced, or enforced adequately. Next slide. The hard work of law is never done. And so when we think about Indigenous laws, they're living, they're adapting, they're changing, they're developing, like all laws. Sometimes when I think about Western law, common law or civil law, it's like a brick wall. It's a very hard and fast, here's the line, do not cross it. It's a brick wall. It's very harsh. But when we think about Indigenous laws, as John Burroughs encourages us to, is think about Indigenous law like a river, constantly flowing and ever adapting to the world around them, and how it can adapt to the way the rocks grow, the way the edge goes, or any of those things, but it's constantly adapting. So we think about Indigenous laws as a river. Next slide. In the TRC final report, they said Aboriginal people must be able to recover and learn and practice their own distinct legal traditions. And so part of that was creating respect for relations. In order to have respect for relations, we have to have that revitalization of Indigenous laws. Next slide. And so when we think about some of those calls to action, number 42 says Indigenous laws formally implemented, practice, resource, enforce. And I'll show you where that's kind of happening. And then 27 and 28, if we're going to talk about laws being enforced and implemented, then we need to create space within that within the legal field for that education. So that's where it comes, creating that continuing education for people within those systems. And then number 50 is creating space for people to reconstruct, develop, and assist communities in revitalizing that. Next slide. So Indigenous laws, we can see it happening in where we see tradition in the Constitution. Traditional laws are recognized and affirmed. We can see it in the Constitution Act. We see it in R versus Vanderpeet, Delgamuukw in British Columbia, and we're starting to see this evolve even now with recent cases. We see it in the courts. In Passion d'État, they recognize the Indigenous legal traditions are among Canada's legal traditions, where they talked about a marriage that was done under Indigenous law and how it was valid. And then in the legislature, we see many examples of people engaging Indigenous laws. Bill C-92, other things. UNDRIP tells us we must engage with Indigenous communities and start to redraft how we think about things. Next slide. So when we think about Indigenous laws in Canada, Indigenous laws it's about Indigenous nations exercising jurisdiction by visibilizing, formalizing, and developing laws as nations. And also engaging in Indigenous law as law is a part of Canada. So that's where we're starting to see it happen. Next slide. Some of the resources where we can find Indigenous laws, we can find law and language. There is a Cree saying that people will say if they really like something, an elder will come up and she'll say this saying in Cree, and I recognize it, but I don't know how to say it. And she'll tell me, "Oh, I really like your earrings" or something, and then I have to. Then by law, that tells me that I must give them my earrings. But they'll never teach me that saying, so I can use it. But then we also see that there's law in words, law in Wahkohtowin, and the meaning behind Wahkohtowin. And we can break that down. There's law in the land. We can hear stories about different rock formations and different things, and what does that mean, and how can we draw out those principles of law. There's law in ceremony. There's implicit and informal practices that can tell us about law. There's law within berry picking. And my aunties are always quick to remind me about those laws. There's laws in our story and within oral history. Next slide. So when I think about some of those approaches to Indigenous law and how we can kind of move forward, one of the things is that we work with Indigenous legal communities. We have a very public, broad reach. So part of that is creating accessible PLE resources to help empower communities to be able to make them feel that this is something they can do, so that they have all that knowledge. We do presentations to communities in various groups. We do a lot of education, judicial education. We do education with judiciary, with lawyers, with everybody in the justice field. And we not only talk about Indigenous laws so that they can learn about it. And so what we can do is we talk to them also about the TRC. We talk about anti-racism and cultural humility, because you can't have one of those conversations without the other. And so one of the things is curating and amplifying those wise practices where other communities are moving. We link them up and show them this is what is possible. And sometimes that's all you need. Then we also do one-on-one coaching and advising. We're kind of that phone a friend when communities are like, I have this issue. How can you help me overcome this? And sometimes it's just having a quick phone call. Sometimes it's referring them to people we know, or come to our workshop, we can help you this way. And then we also do major community-led research projects, which is specific to work by a particular nation, where we work specifically with nations on revitalizing and drafting legislation for them, and starting with looking for those principles and values around whatever law it is that they're drafting. Next slide. So in those community partnered projects, we are community led. We don't go into communities unless we're asked, and so we don't do any advertising. We've been trying to create a TikTok, but we're not TikTok famous. But we have one TikTok, but who knows where we'll go next, because we do need to reach out and get into that down with the kids field. We support and uphold communities' goals and vision for laws and government. We identify and build on their strengths, because many times we find Indigenous communities have everything they need, and sometimes you just need someone to come in and say, look at all of your strengths, look at all these things, and help them tie it all in together. We take a holistic approach to complex issues. We provide training and support to community leaders and workers, applying various methods. So we have a narrative analysis method, which case briefs stories. I know, crazy, but it works. Then we have a linguistic method where we focus on that language. But then we also look at the kinship and visiting methods, where we're just sitting and talking with elders and visiting and building those relationships. We believe in engaging the whole community. Everybody has wisdom, everyone has wisdom, and we need everybody's wisdom for the wisest result. And when we're doing these conversations and having these conversations about law, it's about bringing all of that together and really bringing that richness in. And then we also develop clear language education, which I've talked about. Next slide. So when we're engaging with Indigenous laws, there's many ways to engage with Indigenous laws. We kind of see law as a tree. And so if we were to look at the sources of law, there's law in the sacred, there's natural law, deliberative law, customary, positivistic. And those are the roots of our tree. Those are our sources where we get law. And then there's resources that we can think about of how we can do that. And those resources can be things like stories, they can be language, families, all of those things. And then the application of that law is the top, it's our branches. It's that basis for that innovated for that, like we think about in what are the bases for our environmental stewardship. And so we start to think about how do we apply these principles and practices. And so we can see about Indigenous law it's the intellectual process of deliberating, reasoning, applying those principles and values. And to apply those, you can use various methodologies that lots of researchers have done. And so we really try to bring that full holistic approach when we're working with communities. Next slide. So when we're thinking about Indigenous laws and how do we make that shift and how do we create that and have those conversations, how do we move forward, is we need to shift our assumptions and move past the stereotypes. Many times in the field, so I teach a law class and I always ask people, or I hire research assistants, and I always ask people, well, what's your engagement with Indigenous people? How have you engaged with Indigenous people? And they'll say, well, I handed out soup at the soup kitchen. That's not engaging with Indigenous people. That's engaging with people in poverty who happen to be Indigenous. And so what we do for all of our first year law students, we go to a community, we go to Enoch Cree Nation, and we do a blanket exercise in the community on the reserve where they walk through from when people first came across the ocean to today through a blanket exercise, and then they're able to go through that. But the meaning of being able to do in an Indigenous community, and then to see Indigenous people around them thriving, seeing Indigenous joy, and really seeing Indigenous people as people is such a huge important thing to be able to get to that next level. So we have to move past those stereotypes. Reasoning and reasonable. Indigenous people are reasonable people. I can be a reasonable person. Actually, no, I'm a lawyer, but we had reasonable social and legal orders. We had ways of kinship. We had ways of marriage. We had ways of marrying from different reserves, ways of taking care of each other, laws that just are not written, but we were taught. Present tense. Use present tense to talk about Indigenous law. It's not something that happened very far in the past. It's happening right now today. We have laws when somebody passes away. We have four nights of ceremony. We have songs that are required to be sung. We have laws when your baby's born and how you connect them with the earth. And so it is present tense. We're doing it right now. And then if we think about the particular, think about Indigenous laws as a particular response to universal human issues. How would we deal with poverty? How would we deal with taking care of children? We have those principles and values. It's just how do we bring that forward? How do we make that revitalize those communities? And it's teachings that we've always had. Next slide. So when we think about that shift, there's sometimes some useful questions that we can ask ourselves from. So to take us from Aboriginal justice. What's Aboriginal justice? But to move towards Indigenous laws, what are the legal concepts and categories within this legal tradition? Because they are likely very different from Mohawk to Dene to Cree to Haida. We all have different legal principles and values. And then if we say, what are the cultural values? Well, let's shift that if we talk about laws. What are the legal principles? We think about what's culturally appropriate or traditional dispute resolution forms. We can shift that to thinking, what are the legitimate procedures for collective decision making? So it's really just shifting how we ask those questions, how we think about this. The overall shift is like, what are the rules? What are the answers? What are the rules? What are the answers? But we can shift to saying, what are the legal principles and legal processes for reasoning through these issues? So really just applying that shift as we move forward. Next slide. So some of the challenges that we have when we're engaging and moving forward with Indigenous laws, there's always going to be challenges because nothing is perfect. But some of those challenges, accessibility, intelligibility, applicability, and legitimacy. How do we begin to even make them accessible, make them applicable, make sure they're legitimate? That prolonged state repression, as you can see in that Rooster Renaissance, it led to unevenness of issues. It created that inaccessibility. Enforceability, the lack of funding, formal development, how do we administer and implement these laws, does lead to those legitimate issues. How are we making this effective if they're not enforceable? How do we do that? In our Indigenous communities, we have a civil gap. There's the RCMP and all those things that do that criminal, but where do we get that civil enforcement? And then there's an educational gaps within communities, between communities. Sometimes our communities have been to residential schools. I met with one community, their entire community went to residential school. They were decimated. They were just learning what their teachings were. They had their first powwow about, I think, maybe 8 years ago. The first time that community brought back powwow to communities, just 8 years ago. And they were a community that was surrounded by several of the worst residential schools. So really being able to bring those things back to those communities. But there's also the educational gaps within our own legal communities as well. So we do see the challenges. Next slide. But what I would like to leave you with is there is hope. There, despite all these things, despite the challenges, but moving forward as we start to engage and really take a shift of look of how we're relating to Indigenous laws, I want to share with you a story and a picture. So at Wahkohtowin Lodge, we foster that Wahkohtowin. We teach an on the land course, which is our Wahkohtowin course, and it's learning the principles of Miyawachitowin and through the tanning of a moose hide. So we take law students out to Assiniboine Nation where they learn about tanning a moose hide from start to finish. We learn we're not very good, but we learn about go through those processes to teach them. And so they can engage with the elders, engage with the hide and all of those things. And so this picture is, there's me, myself in the wine hoodie and the Oilers toque. And then there's Professor Lindsay Burrows is beside me, and she's holding her little one. And then in front of me is my daughter, Alice, in the gray sweater. And then beside her is my friend's daughter, Cote, who her mom is a professor of law, also here at the Faculty of Law. How long did it take us to get back to this? This is not something I had the opportunity to do with my mom. This is not something we had the opportunity to do because of what had happened. I didn't get to learn about this. I knew what was above, but my children would have never got this opportunity. But as we start to engage with laws, I was able to share this with them and have two Indigenous law professors with our daughters there teaching a course about law, Indigenous law through the tanning of a moose hide in an Indigenous community. So we're really starting to see where that full circle and giving our children what our parents were not be able to give us because of what had happened. So we really start to see that hope. And so we can engage in Indigenous laws in many ways. And I'm thankful that my daughter got to engage in it in this way. Sometimes she doesn't think what I do is law or what I do is a real lawyer. She's like, this is just too fun. But law can be fun. Law can be full of love, and law can look like this. Thank you. Last slide. And if you ever want to reach out to me, that is my information. I'm pretty easy to find. But thank you all for having me, and I'll turn it back to the hosts. Hi.
Thank you so much, Corin. It was really beautiful to start from the east and then land here, in Treaty 6 territory. And I love how you kind of frame that, moving away from that cultural element to the legal element, because I think, yeah, everybody always just kind of naturally goes there. So thank you so much. And I think it's a good grounding for us to think about as we move forward and how we think differently in our work and reconciliation. So